In the heart of Bainway State, nestled beside the shimmering Bainway River, lay the vibrant village of Aho. Aho was famous for three things: the sweetest yams that could make a grown man weep with joy, the liveliest market days where even the chickens seemed to dance, and most unfortunately, one particularly troublesome young man named Abah. Abah was 20 years old, but possessed the mischievous spirit of a child who had discovered fire for the first time. His grandmother, Mama Age, often said he was born with laughter in his lungs and trouble in his fingertips. That boy, she would sigh while pounding yam, came into this world grinning, and I swear the midwife nearly dropped him because he winked at her. His reputation preceded him wherever he went. The market women would clutch their goods tighter when they saw his familiar swagger approaching. Dogs would bark warnings to their fellow canines. Even the village rooster, a proud bird named General, had learned to crow earlier whenever Abah was about, as if announcing, "Beware, the storm approaches." But Abah's favorite playground was the fertile imagination of the village children. He had elevated the art of scaring them to what he considered a masterpiece of entertainment. There was the great chicken incident of last harvest season, when he had tied raffia grass to his legs and crawled through the market on all fours, clucking like a giant rooster possessed by evil spirits. 3 children had refused to eat chicken for a month, convinced that all poultry had turned against humanity. Then there was the yam ghost episode, where he had buried himself in the yam barn with only his eyes showing, waiting for little Akali to come for his mother's evening meal. The poor boy had run home screaming that the yams were growing faces and trying to talk to him. His mother, Mama Akali, had marched to Abah's compound with a wooden spoon, delivering a lecture that could be heard 3 compounds away about grown men who should know better than to traumatize innocent tubers. But Abah's masterpiece, the one that still made him chuckle months later, was the night of the flying goat. He had convinced his friend Ada to help him tie a rope to old Ijekwa's prize goat and hoist it onto the roof of the grain store. When the children came for their evening lessons at the village tree, they looked up to find a goat apparently defying the laws of nature, standing majestically on the rooftop and bleating with what sounded like supernatural authority. Little Akwi had fainted. Ugbead had started praying in 3 different languages, including some words he seemed to have invented on the spot. And Ochekpa had run home, declaring that the world was ending and goats were preparing to take over the village. The fact that the goat was quite content with its elevated position and had started eating the thatch only added to the mystique. His grandfather, Papa Oga, was both exasperated and secretly proud. "That boy has the creativity of 10 griots and the sense of a palm nut," he would mutter. But there was fondness in his voice, the kind reserved for family members who were simultaneously your greatest joy and your biggest headache. However, even the most patient village has its limits, and the children of Aho were beginning to develop an immunity to Abah's antics. Where once there had been delicious screams of terror, now there were exasperated sighs and eye rolls that could power a grinding mill. "Oh, it's just Abah again," 10-year-old Ugosh had said dismissively when he jumped out from behind a palm tree wearing a calabash on his head and making ghost noises. "Can't you find something better to do? Like help your mother with the farm work?" This casual dismissal stung worse than any scolding. Abah realized with growing horror that his reign of delightful terror was coming to an end. The children were growing up, becoming wise to his ways. Soon they would be teenagers, then adults. And where would that leave him? A has-been prankster, reduced to startling goats and chickens for entertainment. It was during one of these moments of existential crisis that fate presented Abah with an opportunity that seemed too perfect to ignore. The opportunity came on a sweltering Thursday afternoon when the air was so thick you could practically chew it. Papa Oga had enlisted Abah's help in cleaning the communal masquerade hut, a sacred building that stood at the edge of the village like a guardian watching over the river. The hut was older than anyone could remember, built by ancestors whose names had become legends whispered around evening fires. Inside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of palm oil, carved wood, and something indefinable, the accumulated reverence of generations. Masks lined the walls like frozen faces of ancient spirits. The Aigeel with its towering height and mirror decorations, the graceful maiden spirit masks with their delicate white faces, and dozens of others, each with its own story, its own power, its own sacred purpose. But it was the Ogbodo mask that called to Abah like a siren song of mischief. The Ogbodo was magnificent in its terrifying beauty. Carved from dark Iroko wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, it was crowned with an elaborate headdress of horns, cowrie shells, and red cloth that seemed to move even in the still air. Its face was a study in controlled ferocity, not the wild rage of a mad beast, but the calm, implacable authority of a judge who had seen all of humanity's follies and found them wanting. That one, Papa Oga said, noticing Abah's fascination, is not like the others. The Ogbodo is the keeper of justice, the one who walks between worlds to ensure that the living remember their duties to the dead, and the dead remember their love for the living. But all Abah heard was the sound of opportunity knocking. Here was a prop that could restore his reputation, a costume that would make his previous pranks look like child's play. He imagined the delicious terror on the children's faces, the way they would scatter like seeds in the wind, the stories they would tell for years to come. "Grandfather," he said with studied innocence, "the mask is beautiful. Does anyone ever wear it anymore?" Papa Oga gave him a sharp look. "Only during the most sacred ceremonies, and only by those who have been chosen by the elders and blessed by the spirits. It is not a toy, Abah. Remember that." But Abah's mind was already racing ahead to the possibilities. That evening, as the village settled into its familiar rhythms of dinner and conversation, he began to plan. The first night he borrowed the Ogbodo mask was a Tuesday, when the moon was nothing more than a silver fingernail scratch against the black sky. Abah had waited until the compound was silent except for the symphony of night sounds, crickets providing percussion, owls adding haunting melodies, and the distant laughter of hyenas contributing an unsettling harmony. Slipping into the masquerade hut was easier than he had expected. The door, held closed by a simple wooden latch, opened with barely a whisper. Inside, the mask seemed to watch him with hollow eyes, but Abah was too excited to feel the weight of their ancient gaze. The Ogbodo mask was heavier than he had anticipated, carved from solid wood and weighted with ceremonial elements. The accompanying costume was a magnificent creation of raffia grass, red cloth, and leather straps that had been darkened with age and palm oil. When he put it all on, Abah felt transformed. He was no longer a village prankster. He was a force of nature, a walking embodiment of mystery and power. His first target was the communal well, where several children often gathered in the evening to fetch water and share gossip. Abah positioned himself behind a large baobab tree, practicing his most impressive spiritual growls and otherworldly moans. When little Akwi appeared with her water calabash, humming a tune her mother had taught her, Abah struck. He emerged from behind the tree with a sound that was part roar, part wail, and part digestive distress. He had eaten too much pepper soup at dinner. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Akwi's calabash went flying, shattering against a rock in a spray of pottery shards. Her scream could have awakened ancestors 3 generations deep. She fled toward the village proper, her wrapper flapping behind her like the wings of a panicked bird, shouting, "The Ogbodo! The Ogbodo has come for us all." Abah, hidden inside the heavy costume, had to bite his lip to keep from laughing out loud. This was even better than he had hoped. Word of Iagboto's appearance spread through Aho like palm oil on hot yam. By the next morning, the story had grown in the telling until it featured supernatural winds, voices from the beyond, and mysterious lights that danced around the spirit's feet. Abah listened to these embellishments with the satisfaction of an artist whose work was being appreciated beyond his wildest dreams. But this was only the beginning. Over the next week, the Iagboto became a regular fixture of village life. It appeared at the most unexpected moments, always when children were about, always managing to cause maximum chaos and terror. There was the great schoolhouse haunting, when the spirit allegedly entered the classroom during arithmetic lessons, causing every child to declare a spontaneous educational emergency and flee to their respective homes. The teacher, Mr. Oak, spent an hour trying to convince parents that logarithms were not, in fact, summoning evil spirits. Then came the wrestling match incident, which had become the stuff of legend. The weekly wrestling competition was serious business in Aho, where reputations were made and lost in the wrestling circle. The two champions, Odo the Mountain and Adoy the Leopard, were locked in their final bout when the Iagboto appeared at the edge of the circle. The spirit stood perfectly still for a long moment, its horned head tilted as if evaluating the wrestler's technique. Then it released a sound that was part war cry, part spiritual instruction, and part what sounded suspiciously like criticism of their footwork. Both wrestlers, convinced that the ancestors were expressing displeasure with their performance, immediately ceased fighting, bowed respectfully to the spirit, and declared the match a draw in honor of the supernatural visitation. The audience had fled so quickly that several people later found their shoes on the wrong feet, having grabbed whatever footwear was nearest in their haste to escape. But it was the night market appearance that truly established the Iagboto's reputation. Abah had positioned himself near the palm wine cellar stall, knowing that the adults would be relaxed and unprepared for spiritual intervention. When he emerged from behind a stack of yam bags, the effect was like throwing a stone into a pond full of fish. Mama Ode, the palm wine seller, was so startled that she poured an entire calabash of wine onto Chief Ugwa's head instead of into his cup. Chief Ugwa, thinking he was being blessed by the spirit, began dancing a gratitude dance that he appeared to be inventing as he went along. Other adults, caught between terror and reverence, began throwing money at the Iagboto's feet while backing away and reciting every prayer they could remember. Abah had to retreat quickly before the laughter building in his chest exploded out of him and ruined the entire performance. However, as the days passed, Abah began to notice that his reign of supernatural terror was having unintended consequences. The children, while still afraid, were also becoming suspicious. Their fear was beginning to mix with annoyance, and some of the sharper ones were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. "Have you noticed," said Ugosh to his friends one evening, "that the Iagboto only appears when Abah is not around? And did you hear that snorting sound it made last night?" added Ejekwu. "It sounded exactly like Abah when he's trying not to laugh at his own jokes." "Plus," observed Akwi, who had recovered from her initial fright and was now analyzing the situation with the determination of a young detective, "spirits don't usually trip over their own feet. But the Iagboto stumbled exactly like Abah did last week when he was showing off for the girls at the market." Abah realized that his time was running out. The children were growing immune to his newest creation, just as they had with all his previous pranks. But he wasn't ready to give up his greatest performance yet. Meanwhile, the village elders were having their own discussions about the supernatural visitations. Chief Okai, whose wisdom was as deep as the Bainway River and whose patience was considerably shallower, had called a meeting of the village council. "Brothers," he said, settling his considerable bulk onto his carved stool, "we have a situation that requires our attention. The Ogbodo mask, one of our most sacred treasures, has apparently decided to take evening strolls around our village. The other elders nodded gravely. Elder Amodu, who was old enough to remember when the world was newer, stroked his white beard thoughtfully. In my youth, the spirits kept proper hours. They appeared for ceremonies, delivered their messages, and returned to the spirit world with appropriate dignity. This freelancing is highly irregular. What troubles me, added Elder Age, is that our spiritual visitor seems to have developed a sense of humor. Spirits, in my experience, are serious entities. They don't usually concern themselves with frightening children at wells or interrupting wrestling matches. Chief Okai leaned forward, his eyes twinkling with suspicion. Unless, of course, this particular spirit has been, shall we say, recruited by someone with a well-known fondness for mischief and a documented history of traumatizing our youth for entertainment purposes. The name Abah hung in the air unspoken, but clearly understood by everyone present. "What do you propose we do?" asked Elder Amodu. Chief Okai smiled, and it was not entirely a kind smile. "I think our young friend needs a lesson in respecting the sacred traditions of our people, and I believe the spirits themselves should deliver this lesson." That night, Abah prepared for what he planned to be his greatest performance yet. He had heard rumors that some of the elders were beginning to suspect his involvement, so he knew he needed to make this appearance so spectacular, so authentically supernatural, that it would silence all doubts. He slipped into the masquerade hut with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. The familiar weight of the Ogbodo mask settled onto his shoulders like an old friend. He adjusted the raffia costume, practiced his most impressive spirit voice, and prepared to create a memory that would last generations. But as he stepped out of the hut into the humid night air, something felt different. The first sign was the wind. It came from nowhere, a cold breath that had no business existing in the warm evening air of the dry season. It swept through the village with a whisper that sounded almost like voices, carrying with it the scent of rain that hadn't fallen and flowers that didn't grow in this season. Abah paused, suddenly uncertain. In all his previous performances, he had been in complete control of the environment, the timing, the effects. But this wind seemed to be writing its own script. The second sign was the weight of the mask. What had always felt heavy, but manageable, now seemed to be pressing down on him with the accumulated authority of centuries. The carved wood felt warm against his skin, as if it were alive, as if something were awakening within it. The third sign was the silence. The night sounds of Aho, the cricket concerts, the distant laughter, the rustle of palm fronds, all ceased at once, as if the entire village were holding its breath. And then the mask began to speak. It wasn't Abah's voice coming from within the costume. It wasn't any human voice at all. It was something deeper, older, carrying the weight of traditions that stretch back to the beginning of time. It seemed to come from the mask itself, vibrating through the wood and into Abah's bones. "Abah," the voice said, and hearing his name spoken by this ancient presence was like being struck by lightning made of shame and recognition. He tried to respond, to make some joke or excuse, but found that his own voice had disappeared completely. He was no longer the one wearing the mask was wearing him. "You have played with sacred things as if they were toys," the voice continued, each word falling like a stone into still water. "You have used the reverence of your people for your own amusement. You have taken the bridge between worlds and turned it into a stage for your vanity." Abah tried to remove the mask, but his hands would not obey him. They remained at his sides, as if they were no longer his to command. The mask continued its relentless judgment. "Look now upon what you have done." Suddenly, Abah's vision changed. Through the eye holes of the mask, he no longer saw the familiar village of Aho. Instead, he saw the faces of everyone he had frightened, but now he saw them with impossible clarity, as if he were looking directly into their hearts. He saw Akwi not just startled, but genuinely terrified, running home with tears streaming down her face because she thought the spirits were angry with her family. He felt her confusion, her fear that she had somehow offended the ancestors and brought their wrath upon her loved ones. He saw the wrestlers, proud men reduced to bewilderment, their confidence shattered not by superior opponents, but by what they believed was divine disapproval of their sacred sport. Their shame burned in his chest like swallowed fire. He saw his grandfather, Papa Oga, standing in the masquerade hut the morning after the first haunting, running his weathered hands over the empty space where the Ogbodo mask should have been, his face creased with worry and the terrible knowledge of what his grandson had done. But most painfully, he saw the children of Aho, his favorite targets, not as the laughing participants in his grand joke that he had imagined them to be, but as genuine victims of his cruelty. Their fear was real, their distress was real, and their growing suspicion and resentment were real too. You sought laughter, the voice said, but built it on a foundation of others' pain. You wanted to be remembered, but chose to be remembered for the wrong reasons. You had the power to bring joy, but chose instead to bring fear. The mask grew heavier still, not with physical weight, but with the accumulated burden of every frightened child, every disrupted ceremony, every moment of sacred tradition turned into farce. Abah felt as if he were carrying the disappointment of every ancestor who had ever worn the mask with proper reverence and respect. Feel now the weight of your choices, the voice commanded. Understand now the difference between humor that heals and humor that harms. Learn now what it means to be truly sorry. The regret that flooded through Abah was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the shallow embarrassment of being caught in mischief or the temporary guilt that followed his grandfather's scoldings. This was a deep, transformative shame that reached into the very core of who he was and demanded that he become someone better. He understood, with sudden and painful clarity, that his pranks had never been about bringing joy to others. They had been about feeding his own ego, about being the center of attention, about feeling powerful at others' expense. He had told himself that he was entertaining people, but the truth was that he had been entertaining himself at their expense. The vision shifted, and now he saw what could have been. He saw himself using his creativity and humor to genuinely delight people, to bring communities together rather than scatter them in fear. He saw children laughing with him instead of running from him, elders appreciating his wit instead of enduring his disruptions, traditions enhanced by his contributions rather than diminished by his mockery. It is not too late, the voice said, and now there was gentleness in it, the kind of firm compassion that comes from someone who genuinely wants you to succeed. But the choice must be made now, and it must be real. Will you continue to be remembered as the one who made sacred things common, or will you choose to become someone who makes common things sacred? As suddenly as it had begun, the possession ended. The mask became wood and raffia again. The overwhelming presence withdrew, leaving Abah alone with his thoughts and his choices. He found himself on his knees in the dust outside the masquerade hut, the Ogbodo mask lying beside him like a discarded shell of his former self. For a long time, he simply knelt there, trembling not with fear, but with the aftershock of genuine revelation. The village sounds gradually returned, the cricket orchestra resuming their concert, the palm fronds whispering their secrets to the wind, the distant sound of someone laughing at a joke that brought joy instead of pain. When Abah finally stood up, he was a different person than the one who had entered the hut that evening. He picked up the mask with hands that shook with reverence instead of mischief, and carefully returned it to its place among the other sacred objects. This time, when he looked at the collection of masks. He saw not props for his entertainment, but guardians of his people's deepest truths. The next morning brought a miracle that the village of Aho would talk about for generations. Abah appeared at Akwi's compound just as the sun was painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility. But instead of hiding behind a tree or preparing some elaborate joke, he simply walked up to the family's front door and asked to speak with her. When Akwi appeared, cautious and ready to run, Abah did something that no one in the village had ever seen him do before. He knelt down, looked her directly in the eyes, and spoke from his heart. "Akwi," he said, "I owe you an apology that is bigger than words can carry. I have been the one frightening you and the other children. I wore the sacred mask and pretended to be a spirit because I thought it would be funny. But I was wrong. I caused you real fear, real distress, and I am truly sorry." Akwi, who was far wiser than her years suggested, studied his face carefully. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because," Abah said, "I finally learned the difference between making people laugh with me and making them afraid of me. And I don't want to be someone who brings fear into the world anymore." What followed was a conversation that lasted most of the morning, as Abah visited every child he had frightened, every adult he had disrupted, every person whose peace he had disturbed. To each one, he offered not just an apology, but a commitment to do better. The transformation was so complete and so obviously genuine that the entire village buzzed with amazement. Mama Age, his grandmother, wept tears of joy and relief. "That boy," she said, pounding yam with unusual vigor, "has finally learned that the best way to be remembered is not for the biggest noise you can make, but for the most good you can do." Papa Oga, when he learned what had happened, simply nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose faith in redemption had been validated. "The spirits," he said, "have ways of teaching lessons that no earthly teacher can match." In the days and weeks that followed, Abah discovered that helping others brought a satisfaction that no prank ever could. He organized games that brought joy instead of fear, told stories that illuminated instead of obscured, and used his creativity to solve problems instead of creating them. He became the village's favorite storyteller, not because he could frighten people with tales of supernatural terror, but because he could help them see the humor and wisdom in everyday life. Children who had once run from him now sought him out, knowing that time spent with Abah would leave them laughing and thinking in equal measure. And sometimes, when the moon was full and the village was gathered around the evening fire, Abah would tell the story of a foolish young man who tried to make himself important by making others afraid, and how the spirits themselves had to teach him that true importance comes from making others feel valued and safe. The listeners, especially the children, would sit in respectful silence, understanding that some stories are told not just for entertainment, but for education. And they would look at Abah with new appreciation, knowing that the man who could laugh at his own former foolishness had learned one of life's most important lessons, that the best humor comes not from diminishing others, but from celebrating the shared humanity that makes us all worthy of respect and care. The Ogbodo mask, meanwhile, returned to its proper place among the sacred objects of Aho, where it waits still for the next ceremony, the next proper ritual, the next moment when the bridge between worlds needs to be crossed with appropriate reverence and respect. And sometimes, when the light hits it just right, those who look closely swear they can see it smiling, not with mischief, but with the satisfaction of a teacher whose most difficult student has finally learned the lesson that matters most. Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe.